Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to knit the tubular cast on with waste yarn for 2x2 ribbing when you're knitting in the round. So that probably sounds very specific, but the reason that's important is because the tubular cast on is going to be different for first if you're knitting flat or in the round, and also the type of ribbing you're knitting. So are you knitting 1x1 ribbing or 2x2 ribbing? So particularly in this video, it's going to be 2x2 ribbing, which is knit 2, purl 2, and then it's going to be knit in the round. So typically you'll see this type of cast on used typically in clothing items. So it could be something like the bottom of a sleeve cuff or like the bottom of a sweater, the rim of a hat. You can see it in a lot of different places. And the reason it's popular is because it really creates a really clean edge and it looks like very professional. So the different materials we need are laid out in front of me right now. So first up, I have my main fabric yarn. So this is what I'm actually knitting my project out of. Then next to that, I have my waste yarn. So typically the waste yarn should be about the same weight as your main fabric yarn. It doesn't need to be anything fancy because we're just going to cut it out at the end. And how much of it you need depends on how many stitches you need to cast on. Next, I have a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle, and then for my knitting needle, a lot of times your pattern will tell you what size knitting needle to do this tubular cast on in. And typically it's going to be the same size as your ribbing or one size smaller. So reference your pattern for the tubular cast on size or your ribbing size. And then lastly, to switch around stitches, we're going to need something. So you can either use a double pointed needle if you have one of those, or I like to use a cable needle. So here's a cable needle. So let's get started. To start off with this pattern, we're just going to have to do a little bit of math. And that's because the number of stitches we cast on with our waste yarn is different than the number of stitches that we actually end up with in our ribbing. So I'm going to start off with my number of stitches in my ribbing. So let's say I needed to knit 2x2 in the round ribbing with 32 stitches. So maybe that's like how many stitches are in my sleeve cuff. So to figure out how many stitches to cast on with the waste yarn, I'm going to take that same value, so 32, divided by 2 plus 1. So my value, that would be 16, plus 1 would be 17. So that tells me how many stitches I want to cast on with my waste yarn. So next up, I'm going to cast on those 17 stitches. And the nice thing about this method is it doesn't matter what cast on method you actually use to add the waste yarn to the knitting needle. So my preferred method is the long tail cast on. So that's the method I'm going to be using to cast on those 17 stitches. So now that I've cast on those 17 stitches, I'm going to turn my work. And now on this side, I'm going to purl across. And instead of using my waste yarn, I'm going to use my actual project yarn. So I'm going to join my project yarn by just laying it right over the knitting needle as I go into purl, pull it through, and continue purling all the way across this row. Now I'm going to turn my work, and on this side, there's a repeat I want to work over and over again. So I'm going to knit one stitch. Then using my left knitting needle point, I'm going to go into that bar that's in between the stitch I just worked and the one I'm about to work, from front to back. So again, I just take that left knitting needle point, go underneath that bar from front to back. And now I want to take my right knitting needle point, bring my yarn to the front, purl into that stitch. Now again, I'm going to bring my yarn to the back, knit one, and again, I'm going to take my left knitting needle point, front to back underneath that bar, bring my yarn to the front, purl into that stitch. So to show it one more time, I'm going to knit one stitch, take my left knitting needle point, front to back underneath the bar, bring my yarn to the front, purl into that stitch. And now I'm going to continue repeating this until 2 stitches remain. Now that 2 stitches remain, I'm going to knit one stitch, Then I'm going to pick up the next bar, again going from front to back. And now I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, and I'm going to purl the picked up bar and the final stitch together. So I'm going to put my right knitting needle point into both of those stitches, wrap my yarn around, and pull through. Now I do like to pull on my tail there, just to tighten up all these loops at the end. So now as I count across, I should have the number of stitches I want for my ribbing. So for example, I wanted 32 stitches, so as I count across, I should have exactly 32 loops on the knitting needle. So now that I've verified I do have those 32 stitches on my knitting needle, I'm going to turn my work, and across this next row, we aren't actually going to work anything. All we're going to do is we're going to rearrange stitches. And the reason we have to rearrange the stitches is because basically the tubular cast on is typically, the way it's cast on, it looks like knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. But we want it to look like knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. So we're going to rearrange these cast on stitches. So what I'm going to be using to rearrange them is first my right knitting needle point, and then also my cable needle or double pointed needle. So first I want to slip the first stitch onto the right knitting needle. Then I'm going to take the next stitch, slide it onto a cable needle, hold it in the back of my work, so behind my knitting needle. Then I'm going to slip one stitch for my left knitting needle, and I'm going to re-add on the one from my cable needle onto my right knitting needle. Then I'm going to slip one more stitch from my left knitting needle. Now I'm going to repeat that over again. So to show it one more time, I'm going to slip one stitch from my left needle to my right needle. Then I'm going to take the next stitch, hold it in the back of my work on my cable needle, slip one stitch from my left to right knitting needle, re-add on the one from the cable needle to your right knitting needle, then slip one more stitch from the left knitting needle to the right one. So it's essentially a 4-stitch repeat where you just slip the first stitch, then you switch out the second and third one, so we're just rearranging those two, and then you slip the fourth one regular. And we're going to continue that over and over again all the way across. Now that I've finished rearranging all those stitches, I just want to take my work and I want to re-slide all the stitches back over to my other knitting needle. So there's two ways you can do this. You can either just repass them all from your right knitting needle to your left knitting needle, or if you're on a long circular cord, you can just grab onto all the stitches, take your knitting needle, pull it towards the left until all your stitches end up back on the other side. Okay, so I'll know my knitting is back in the right place when I have a knitting needle point pointed towards the right, and my working yarn is also over here on the right side of my work. So that's how I know I'm back at the beginning. I'm about to knit the right thing. But what we want to do here is we actually want to prepare to join in the round. So the way I join in the round is to knit using magic loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide it over to the cord, pick out somewhere in the middle, bend the cord in half, and then slide my work so that each half is back up on a knitting needle. So now I basically have my work divided in two. Half of my stitches, the one with the working yarn coming out of it, are on the back knitting needle. And then the other half of my stitches, the one without the working yarn, is on the front knitting needle, or the one closest to me. So what I want to work on this round is going to be knit 2, bring the yarn to the front, slip 2 purlwise. Then I'm going to bring the yarn to the back and repeat it again. Knit 2, bring the yarn to the front, slip 2 purlwise. And I'm going to continue that all the way around this first round. So if you're familiar with magic loop, basically I'm going to take my working yarn, go in between the two knitting needles, then up over this back knitting needle so I don't end up with an extra yarn over. Now I'm going to take my back knitting needle, I'm going to pull it towards the right, and I'm just going to begin working this first stitch on the front knitting needle. So I'm going to work knit 2, bring the yarn to the front, slip 2 purlwise. Bring the yarn to the back, repeat again. Now, if you're knitting magic loop or if you're using double pointed needles, just be careful when you have the final 2 purl stitches in between 2 knitting needles. You just want to make sure to not pull the yarn that you're holding in front too tight or too loose. You kind of want to keep the same tension as you had across the other ones, even as you switch from one knitting needle to the other one. And now here at the end of the round, again, I'm going to slip these final 2 stitches purlwise, turn my work, and reset up for magic loop. Now in this next round, the first set of 4 is going to be a little bit different, but then we're going to have a repeat again. So this time, I want to knit my first stitch, slip the second stitch purlwise with the yarn in back, bring the yarn to the front, then purl 2. So the tricky thing is with magic loop is like when you had just slipped 2 stitches at the end of a round, but then you want to knit the next stitch. What I do is I take that yarn that I've just slipped, now I'm going to bring it in between the 2 knitting needles, up over the back knitting needle, pull the back knitting needle towards the right, go into the first stitch, knit. Now just slip that first stitch purlwise, bring my yarn to the front, purl 2, and now we can begin the repeat. So the repeat is bring the yarn to the back, slip 2 stitches purlwise, bring the yarn to the front, purl 2. And I'm going to continue that all the way across this round. And just to be clear, when I say round, I mean both sides of this magic loop. Or if you're on double pointed needles, you want to continue across every one of the double pointed needles until you're back at your beginning of the round. So now we've completed all the setup rounds. So what you want to do now is you want to continue working your knit 2, purl 2 ribbing for about an inch or so. Then next I'm going to show you how to cut out this waste yarn and double check that your cast on edge is good and that nothing's going to unravel. So I'll come back and show you that. Now once I've worked a little ways and before I've knit like the full sleeve or anything like that, I'm going to take out my waste yarn. And I like to take out my waste yarn earlier on so that way if anything begins to unravel, I can start over again, fix my mistake before basically I've knit for a really long time. So how we're going to go about taking out the waste yarn is just to use a pair of scissors. And what I like to do is turn it upside down and then stretch it out. And you see how there's kind of like those gaps in between the gold yarn and the white yarn up there at the top? I'm going to put my scissors through each one of those gaps and cut the white yarn. So now that I've cut all that, I'm just going to go along this bottom edge and pull out each one of these strands. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go along the bottom edge and I'm just going to stretch out my work and make sure that it doesn't look like anything's about to unravel. So the place that I always try and pay a lot of attention to is right over here at the beginning. So where my tail is coming out, what I like to do with this tail is I'm going to use a tapestry needle and then I'm just going to take this side, then I'm just going to take and basically connect the one side go up into one of the purl bumps in here. And then I'm going to go back down and out this other knit side. So that helps to close up that gap where right at the beginning we were knitting a few rounds where it was just flat and it wasn't in the round yet. So now I've kind of concealed that a little bit, and then I would just go ahead and weave in this end so that it matches the rest of my edge. So that is how you do a tubular cast on for 2x2 ribbing in the round. Down in the description box below, you're going to find the full written version of the pattern. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave those down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. I'm putting out lots of new videos all the time, so that's the best way to stay up to date. At the end of this video, I'm going to put the full playlist of different tubular cast on methods. So that way, if you're curious about any of the other stitch counts or doing 1x1 ribbing, you can check out all those videos there. I'll see you next time.